My father has died. His body was found entombed in the sewage pipes beneath our home. The body of a fully grown man, mercilessly crammed into the constricted confines of the sewer pipes. As I sifted through letters from my father, I stumbled upon a veiled warning. Beware of mother. In the deep silence of the night, a sudden noise jolted me awake. Eerie sounds drifted from the bathroom. It resembled the soft tapping of fingernails. With caution, I slipped out of bed and eased the bathroom door open. Straining my ears, I realized the sounds were emanating from the sewer. Could it be rats lurking in the sewer? I furrowed my brow in disgust, poised to leave, when suddenly, a chilling gurgle. From the sewer emerged a ghastly puddle of fresh blood. A shriek ripped from my throat. Half an hour later, the police had cordoned off the bathroom entrance. I was nestled in my mother's embrace, quivering with fear. "Everything's going to be all right, baby," my mother soothed repeatedly. The police shattered the sewer's cover. What they dragged out was a grotesquely compressed and deformed body. The sight of a conspicuous black mole on the corpse's hand widened my eyes in terror. It was my father's body. He had been cruelly stuffed alive into the sewer pipe. It was a notion bordering on the impossible. Though not tall, my father bore the build of a grown man. I had heard tales of premature infants swept away in toilets, but never of an adult man crammed into a sewer pipe. I held on to my mother's hand, sobbing with a ferocity that tore through the silence. She shielded my eyes and whispered through her tears, "Baby, don't look." The removal of my father's body was swift. No evidence of a struggle marred our home. The sole clue was an unfamiliar pair of size 41 shoe prints in the bathroom. The police concluded these belonged to a flat-footed man about 178 centimeters tall. The shock of my father's death reverberated through the county. On the day of his funeral, I sat isolated in my room, fighting back tears as I sifted through the letters he had written to me. Our letters had always been our sacred conduit of connection. He was a man consumed by his work, driven by a relentless pursuit to provide for us. We penned our deepest thoughts and confessions in those letters. Flipping through them one by one particular letter caused my brow to crease. Its phrasing was peculiar, almost to the point of being unintelligible. "You were quite the handful as a child, mischievous yet immensely endearing. I have many dreams that propel you forward. Both Mom and Dad adore you. Mom's getting older. You must show her patience." I pored over these lines with care. Suddenly, I shot to my feet. The first character of each sentence melded into 4 words. "Be careful of Mom." The letter tumbled from my grasp. Was it mere coincidence, or, as confusion swirled within me, my mother entered. She donned a black dress, her demeanor weary. Her eyes were swollen from recent tears. "Yao Yao, come help me bid farewell to the guests," she said. Subconsciously, I wadded up the letter, clutching it firmly. "All right, Mom." Then, I saw her eyes, intensely focused on my clenched hand. An unsettling expression shadowed her face. "What do you have in your hand?" Her direct gaze held me. A sheen of sweat formed on my forehead. "It's a letter from Dad." She was aware of how Dad and I loved this mode of conversation. Yet, her eyes didn't move from my hand. "Could I see it?" she asked tenderly. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes, devoid of any warmth. Of course, I had no grounds to deny my mother, and so I handed her the letter. As she scanned the words, her eyes swiftly welled up with tears. She drew a deep breath, evidently fighting back her tears. "Your father truly loved us." She gave the letter back to me. The faint doubts I had about her dissolved. A wave of guilt washed over me. How could I ever suspect my mother? She had loved my father deeply. After the guests had departed, I ventured into the study my father had cherished in life. In a somber mood, I began to sift through the relics he had left behind. Suddenly, as I lifted one of my father's notebooks, a piece of paper drifted out. The message on it read, "My dear daughter, if you're reading this, I might no longer be with you. Please revisit the photo we took together last month. Remember, your father will always love you." Instantly, my brow creased, and my heart pounded fiercely. Clearly, a month before, my father had anticipated his demise. Considering the bizarre circumstances of his death, a chill of apprehension trickled down my spine. Displayed on the desk was a photo of my father and me. This photo dates back a month. At the time, my father was engrossed in work within his study, while I sat nearby, immersed in a book. Suddenly, he turned to me, his face breaking into a smile. "Yao Yao, it struck me that we haven't snapped a photo together in a long while. Shall we take one now?" His request caught me off guard, yet I consented. I lifted the photo frame, scrutinizing it meticulously. Abruptly, my pupils tightened. In the photo, my father and I leaned close, both of us sporting smiles. But behind us, the door to the study, which should have been shut tight, was slightly ajar. My gaze locked onto that sliver of a gap in the door within the photo. From behind it peeked an eye that was glued to the gap, intensely fixed on us. This was the secret my father intended to reveal with the photo. Terror surged through me, sending my heart into a frenzy. My father had predicted his death a month ago and had hinted through the photo that someone was behind the door, watching us. Who was this person hidden behind the door? Could this be the killer of my father? Or, those 4 words haunted my thoughts again. Be careful of Mom. At that very moment, I sensed a sinister gaze upon me. I spun around abruptly. The door to the study was slightly ajar. A chill crept up from the soles of my feet. I was sure the door had been shut when I entered. All this while, someone had been silently standing outside, observing every move I made. Suppressing my fear, I pushed the door open and stepped out. On the floor lay a shard of crimson fingernail. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was from my mother's hand. It was difficult to comprehend that it had been my mother at the door, silently watching me. With a surge of courage, I approached her bedroom door. It was dark inside. No light shone from under the door. My throat tightened. Driven by some inexplicable impulse, I crouched and peered through the gap beneath the door. But then, I saw a pair of eyes, bloodshot and with unnaturally dilated pupils. Clearly, these were not the eyes of the living. A corpse lay hidden in my mother's room. I recoiled in shock, only to back into a pair of cold legs. My mother's head drooped onto my shoulder. Her eyes skewed as she peered at me. "Yao Yao, what are you doing?" My heart thudded at its peak pace. "Mom, I miss Dad." I gripped the hem of her clothes, trembling. My mother gazed at me without expression, as though gauging my reaction. A fine sheen of sweat appeared on my forehead. Finally, my mother sighed. "Yao Yao, Mom misses Dad too. But we must gather ourselves. We have a long journey ahead, and Dad surely would want us to live well." She pulled me into an embrace. Her body was alarmingly cold. An involuntary shudder ran through me. I noticed that her index finger was missing a fingernail. The one who had been spying outside the study was undeniably my mother. I longed to question her about why she was spying on me, but I found the words wouldn't come. "Mom, I don't want to be alone. May I stay in your room for a while?" I asked, lifting my head and smiling. I needed to see for myself whether there was indeed a corpse in my mother's room. Surprisingly, she agreed immediately. As the door opened, my heart seized. However, the room held no sign of the woman's corpse I had seen through the door's crack. Where had the body disappeared to? Was what I had seen merely a hallucination? In my heart, I truly did not wish to suspect my mother. Throughout my life, she had cared for me with great detail. My classmates' parents often fight, but my parents had always shared a deep bond. Even though my mother could be strict, she was undeniably a good mother. Gradually, my doubts about her began to fade. "Come, Yao Yao. Let Mom sit with you on the bed for a while." My mother grasped my hand, and we nestled together on the bed as we often did. Her nightgown unintentionally slipped off her shoulder. On her exposed shoulder, I spotted a peculiar tattoo. It was yellow, a distorted and eerie symbol. I frowned. I had never before seen such a tattoo on my mother. She seemed to notice my startled look and swiftly adjusted her gown. At that moment, I suddenly heard a very odd noise from under the bed. It resembled the sound of a throat being squeezed, issuing a broken breath. "Mom, do you hear that?" I asked, ears sharpened and filled with anxiety. "Yes, it seems to be coming from under the bed." My mother's expression grew tense. She signaled for me to remain on the bed and not move. Inhaling deeply, she bent down and lay on the floor. Suddenly, she emitted a piercing scream. I sprang from the bed instantly. Upon seeing what lay beneath, my blood seemed to turn to ice. There was a woman under the bed. It was the corpse I had previously encountered. Her limbs had been unnaturally stretched to grotesque proportions. Each was nailed to a corner of the bed. Most horrifyingly, she was still alive. Her pupils were enormously dilated. Yet, she was breathing. She struggled to move her head. Then, straining, she twisted her mouth and eyes into an exaggerated smile, staring directly at me. The next moment, she seemed to exhale her final breath. Her head fell abruptly, like a kite with its string cut. I felt distinctly that she had kept her gaze on me until the very end. After my mother called the police. The police arrived swiftly. They calmed us and asked us to wait outside. Sitting anxiously on the sofa, my mother held me close and reassured me, "Baby, don't be afraid. Mom is here." The police found a half-eaten piece of paper in the corpse's mouth. It appeared to have been swallowed in extreme panic. Written on it was a name. It was Uncle Lee's name, our next-door neighbor. Uncle Lee was perennially affable and well-liked. Since their child succumbed to illness a decade ago, he and Aunt Lee have embraced me as their own. The notion of Uncle Lee as a murderer strains credulity. The police swiftly removed the corpse. Night, as sleep nearly claimed me, eerie noises echoed from the living room. Bang, bang, as if something were assaulting the walls. The noise woke me, and a piercing cold enveloped the house. Though winter, this chill was unnaturally severe. A delicate frosting etched the windows. I stepped out of my room. Darkness enveloped the living room. A shadowy silhouette loomed by the wall, repeatedly striking it with her head, the thuds resonant and unsettling. My voice trembled as I called out, "Mom!" She ceased abruptly. Frozen in place, she stood stark and rigid. "Mom, what's happening?" My voice was laden with worry. My concern stemmed from a fear that she might be unraveling from my father's death, possibly engaging in self-harm. She turned her head abruptly. A chill swept down my spine. In the shadowy light, it seemed as if some unseen force had wrenched her head around. Her mouth opened. "Yao Yao, aren't you asleep yet?" Yet the voice was not that of my mother. It was ambiguous, piercingly sharp. Her mouth was grotesquely agape. I glimpsed numerous minute entities writhing within. A scream tore from my throat as I awoke from the nightmare. That night, I was plagued by restless sleep. In a half-asleep daze, an itch teased at my neck. When I reached to scratch, the sensation eerily vanished. At dawn, the blare of police sirens jolted me awake. I bolted upright. About to step out of bed, I spotted several strands of long black hair beside my pillow. I picked them up, my brow furrowed. Since the summer, when I had cut my hair to shoulder length, it couldn't be mine. They resembled my mother's hair more. An appalling vision flashed before me. My mother standing beside my bed the previous night, head bowed, her dark hair draped over and touching my neck. A chill swept over me, but there was no time to dwell on it. As I watched several police officers make their way into Uncle Lee's house from my window. 5 minutes later, Uncle Lee, his hands bound in handcuffs and his head hung low, was ushered out by the police. My heart raced, more from disbelief than fear. Could Uncle Lee genuinely be the killer of that woman? He had showered me with affection and adored the local children deeply, especially after losing his own. Imagining him capable of such brutality was unfathomable. Then suddenly, Uncle Lee seemed to feel my gaze. His eyes intensely pierced mine. With his eyes wide and his mouth moving silently, he mouthed a single word to me, "Run." I gazed at Uncle Lee, my eyes wide with shock. Suddenly, as though he had glimpsed some unspeakable horror, Uncle Lee dropped his head as if struck by lightning. I turned to find my mother standing quietly behind me, her fingers lightly touching my shoulders, trembling ever so slightly. Her face bore a complex mix of emotions. Sadness laced with a restrained fury. Yao Yao, there's something difficult I need to tell you. We've found the person who killed your father. Shock rooted me to the spot as I looked into my mother's eyes, my voice shaking. Who? Who killed Dad? It was Uncle Lee. The police discovered the murder weapon in his home, stained with your father's and that woman's blood. And that shoe print in our bathroom? It belonged to Uncle Lee as well. There were only a woman's fingerprints on that crumpled piece of paper. Your father and he were usually on good terms, and I cannot fathom why he would so savagely kill your father. Mother's voice broke, and she could speak no further. Her words stirred a peculiar unease within me. It all seemed too coincidental. The paper wad found in the woman's mouth, the footprints in the bathroom. The murderer had employed a method so devoid of humanity, torturing his victim until death. If Uncle Lee was indeed the culprit, why would he leave behind such damning evidence? And what was he trying to convey with that urgent run? His face had turned to sheer terror upon seeing my mother behind me. Why would a man who had murdered my father fear my mother? Though plagued by doubts, I chose not to challenge my mother. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Mother dried her tears and answered the door. There stood 2 police officers and Uncle Lee, now in handcuffs. Their eyes carried a hint of sympathy as they regarded us. He insisted on coming here to say sorry, no matter what, one officer explained. Mother, eyes brimming with tears, fixed a stern gaze on Uncle Lee and demanded in a strained voice, "Why did you kill him? What could we possibly have done to deserve this?" Uncle Lee's eyes lingered on my mother momentarily before turning to me. In a sudden burst, he wrenched free from the police and dashed towards me frantically. He whispered hurriedly into my ear. I slowly widened my eyes in surprise. Uncle Lee had said, "Trust no one, not even the police. I didn't kill your dad or that woman. All the secrets are in the diary, hidden in the floor of my bedroom." The police swiftly subdued him. Mother quickly pulled me behind her for protection. Uncle Lee was soon taken away by the officers. A heavy weight settled in my chest as I dwelled on his words, trying to understand their true meaning. Shortly after Uncle Lee's departure, I knocked on his house door. Aunt Lee, seeing me, knelt abruptly before me. She bowed deeply, repeatedly asking for forgiveness. I quickly assisted Aunt Lee to her feet. She shakily retrieved a bank card from her pocket. "This is all the savings I have from over the years, about 100,000. It's not a lot, but it's what I can offer as compensation."
Y declina Taun Lee.
In my heart, I could not accept that Uncle Lee was the culprit. "Aunt, may I look in Uncle Lee's room?" I asked gently. Aunt Lee, though slightly puzzled, nodded. Uncle Lee's room was upstairs that I entered Uncle Lee's room, making sure Aunt Lee hadn't followed, and promptly began searching the floor. I found the hidden compartment with ease, opened it, and there lay a diary. The entries dated back to 1 month ago. Of late, I felt a ceaseless gaze upon me. Ultimately, I identified its origin. It was from my wife. One night, I awoke suddenly to find her crouching at the head of the bed, staring intently at me with an eerie smile. I stumbled upon a horrifying fact. Every April, 3 people die under strange circumstances in this town, their deaths seemingly unfeasible by human hands. Moreover, each deceased had been, like me, an outsider. Tucked within this diary page were clippings from newspapers detailing several murders from 2019 to 2021. One report from April 1, 2019, described a woman's body cut into pieces and found in a toilet tank, her husband having discovered it when the water turned ominously blood red as he flushed. On April 5, a man fell from a bed barely a meter off the ground, yet he died from skull fractures indicative of a fall from great heights. On April 22, a woman was found in her wardrobe, her body entirely drained of blood. Cold sweat began to seep from my brow. As noted in Uncle Lee's diary, every April sees 3 murders. Each death was gruesomely bizarre and unfathomably cruel. And now it was April once more. Trembling, I turned the next page. This was the final entry in the diary. It was written just a week ago. With April upon us, I've unraveled the grim secret of our town. I am doomed to die this month. To whoever finds this diary, be vigilant of anyone with yellow markings on their person. Take heed. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the staircase. I hastily stowed the diary and left the room as though everything was normal. Yao Yao, please take this bank card. I won't have peace of mind unless you accept it. Aunt Lee pressed the card into my hands. Then I noticed a line of minuscule text on the bank card. Escape this place, the farther the better. Startled, I looked up at her, and despite everything, Aunt Lee smiled apologetically at me as though nothing had happened. That night, Aunt Lee met her end. Her body was chillingly discovered inside the refrigerator. No mark suggested she had been dragged. It looked as if Aunt Lee had opened the fridge herself and crawled in. The most horrific part was that her head had been savagely torn off. No wild animals roam our town, nor were there any animal tracks around. Her body was found sitting inside, her own head cradled in her hands. From my window, I watched as Aunt Lee's body was carried out. A sudden gust of wind flipped back a corner of the white sheet on the stretcher. For a fleeting moment, Aunt Lee's head seemed to turn towards me. Her eyes, tightly closed until then, abruptly opened wide. They stared at me, unnervingly exaggerated. A shiver of horror swept through me, and I stumbled back. When I dared look again, Aunt Lee's eyes had closed. Her pale, grayish arms dangled lifelessly. On her arm, bizarrely, was a yellow tattoo identical to my mother's. What could this tattoo represent? This month, with Aunt Lee included, exactly 3 people had perished. The grim April curse of 3 deaths had recurred. Yet, unlike before, aside from my father, both Aunt Lee and that woman were locals, born and raised here in the county. Only my father, who met my mother while she was studying abroad, came to settle here. In the last 5 years, no locals had perished. Why then, suddenly, have 2 locals died? The message Aunt Lee left on the bank card was unmistakably a warning. Both she and Uncle Lee had implored me to leave. Yet, Uncle Lee's diary warned against those with yellow markings. What was truly happening? That evening, Mom, I'd like to discuss something. It's summer break, and I think it's time I saw a bit of the world. I've never left here my whole life, and now as I'm about to become an adult, I want to explore. I gauged my mother's reaction cautiously. Her initially smiling face turned quickly stern. She clutched my shoulders, her fingers digging painfully deep. Mom can't let you go out now. Your father has just left us. Do you want to leave me too? Her eyes were laced with red veins, her face contorted as she stared at me. I was unnerved by her intense look. Mother relaxed her grip, realizing her reaction had been too strong.
I'm sorry, Yao Yao.
Can you stay here and keep me company? She asked, almost pleadingly. I noticed then just how much older she looked these past few days. Flooded with memories of her past kindness, I began to question my initial suspicions. Okay, Mom. Tears welled up in Mother's eyes as she pulled me into an embrace. A long overdue moment of closeness. But then, I detected a faint blood scent on her. I frowned, yet restrained myself from thinking further. Deep into the night, I lay awake, restless and uneasy. Suddenly, a prolonged shadow slid under the door seam. The shadow on the floor seemed off. It appeared she was holding something. The object looked like a sharp fruit knife. A frigid fear slowly rose within me. The door handle creaked, turning ever so slightly. Yet, evidently, the person outside did not open the door. I had securely locked the door before I had entered the room. My eyes fixated on the door handle. It twisted again, a couple of times, then stopped. Footsteps receded outside. The shadow on the floor faded. I exhaled in relief, but a moment later, an icy dread crept up my spine. It felt as though a venomous gaze was intently fixed upon my back. Abruptly, I turned. My mother's face was hauntingly pressed against the window glass. Her face was mashed against it, her features grotesquely distorted as she stared into my eyes. "Mom, what are you doing?" I shouted, my voice tinged with panic. Her lips began to curl into a slow, unsettling smile. "I just came to check on you. I was worried you might be frightened alone, but found the door locked." Concerned, I moved to the window. She raised the knife she was holding. "If you haven't gone to bed yet, let me cut some fruit for you." "Mom, I'm fine, really, no need. I don't want anything. Please, go get some rest." Gazing at my mother's ghastly pale face through the window, my heart raced. "All right, I'll go rest then." She nodded and departed. I let out a long breath, my hands slick with sweat. Then, my phone vibrated sharply twice. I received a text. As I recognized the sender, my eyes gradually widened. It was from my father. "My dear daughter, receiving this message must be a shock. It's scheduled, and by now, Dad might no longer be beside you. Remember, no matter what, you can always trust your father. Dad will always love you. If you find yourself missing Dad deeply, why not peruse the photographs from your childhood onwards? You are sure to unearth new insights there." This message, his last, hinted that my father wanted to convey something. I leapt out of bed, opened the wardrobe, and retrieved a hefty photo album. The album chronicled my life in photographs, from infancy onward. The inaugural photo captured the moment of my birth. My mother cradled me with immense tenderness, and my father looked on, his face alight with a gentle smile. I eagerly flipped further into the past. I paused at a photograph from when I was 5. Surrounded by a throng of giggling children, I was pictured at a kindergarten summer camp. That photo marked the very first night I spent away from the protective embrace of my parents. Suddenly, my eyes were inexplicably drawn to a corner of the photo. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Behind me, barely concealed by an old tree, stood a figure. Their face was shrouded in shadow, but their eyes bore into mine with an unsettling intensity. In the darkness, her face was ghostly pale. It was my mother. I held my breath and turned the page. There I was, a 12-year-old boy, joyfully building sandcastles in the park with my best friend. I vividly recall my mother mentioning that day she felt ill and needed to go to the hospital. Yet, there in the photo under a park bench, a tuft of black hair ominously peeked out. There, unmistakably, someone was crouched down, their head lowered, their hair veiling the face, except for a single eye peeking out. Indisputably my mother's. My hand, clutching the photo, began to quiver uncontrollably. At 14, alongside my childhood friend, I ventured to an amusement park to ascend the Ferris wheel. This snapshot captured me inside the Ferris wheel, flashing a peace sign at the camera with a joyous, uninhibited laugh. At this very moment, an icy chill seizes me. The figure seated behind me in the photograph is undeniably my mother. She seems to have caught me in the act of taking a selfie, her response a peculiar, unsettling smile directed at the camera. I shiver uncontrollably, hastily scattering the photos everywhere. What I eventually uncover is nothing short of macabre. My mother's presence haunts each image. Even during that solitary overnight stay at my childhood friend's home, we were stretched out on the bed, and there, half emerging from beneath it, was my mother, her neck craned, eyes intensely focused on me. These sinister snapshots had been unwittingly captured. Having neglected this album since adulthood, it is only now that I come to a chilling realization. My mother had always been silently observing me. This was the secret my father intended to reveal through the photograph. A shiver crept up my spine. It was almost unthinkable that my mother, always so warm and attentive, had been keeping a vigilant eye on me. Suddenly, a peculiar rustling echoed from outside the door. It sounded like someone treading with a ghostly lightness. My heart skipped, and I hurriedly rearranged the photos to their original order. "Yao Yao, are you asleep?" Her voice filtered through the door. I froze, holding my breath, too frightened to respond. The rustling faded momentarily. It seemed she had departed. Yet, before relief could wash over me, the sound returned, persistent at my door. An unnerving vision seized me. My mother, creeping silently on tiptoes, pacing by my door. This notion sent a shiver through me, goosebumps prickling my skin. Why would she linger, pacing outside my room? Yao Yao, are you asleep? Her voice came again, lighter, as if she whispered by design. In that moment, my anxiety peaked. I remained silent, breath held. The voice did not come again for a long while. With great caution, I left my bed, edged toward the door, and pressed my ear against it. Suddenly, faint breaths whispered from behind the door. My mother was still outside. My teeth uncontrollably chattered. This stranger side of my mother was deeply unsettling. Fear gripped my heart. Resolved, I glanced at the window, determined to flee from her. With careful movements, I opened the window and slipped into the yard. Once outside, I walked the empty, dark streets. The night was bleak, the cold biting. Shivering, I decided to seek refuge at my grandmother's house. Upon seeing me in just my pajamas, my grandmother's face showed a mix of shock and concern as she quickly welcomed me in. She handed me a cup of warm milk and asked what had happened. Hesitating, I opted not to divulge my mother's unsettling behavior. Yao Yao, did you have a quarrel with your mom and slip out here? Grandma probed softly, sensing my silence. I nodded non-committally. With a sigh, Grandma said, though your mother may seem stern, she truly loves you. It's gotten late. Stay here and sleep tonight. That night, I slept in the guest room at Grandma's house. It had been 5 years since my last stay. Nothing in the room had changed. Glancing around, my eyes caught a peculiar statue on the bedside cabinet. The statue had a serpent's head, but its body was a cluster of sinuous tentacles. At just one glance, an unsettling discomfort washed over me. This sensation was peculiarly intense, my brain pulsing and my eyes beginning to burn as if myriad hands were massaging my mind. Why would Grandma keep such an eerie statue? Exhausted, I soon drifted off after lying down. Deep into the night, a cold, sticky sensation began tracing my body. I snapped my eyes open. The statue that had been on the nightstand was now on my bed, its sinister crimson eyes locking onto mine. In a surge of terror, I flung the statue to the floor. It shattered instantly, spilling a foul-smelling crimson liquid. What was this ghastly object? I was seized by fear. Suddenly, a rustling sound emerged. It sounded like whispered voices. The noise seemed to come from the next room, Grandma's room. It sounded as though Grandma was having a conversation. I pressed my ear against the wall. Yao Yao, sneaking off to your place in the middle of the night without a word. I was about to call the police. It was my mother's voice. Mother knew I had fled to Grandma's. A shiver ran down my spine, yet the thought of Grandma nearby reassured me. My mother would not harm me. Yao Yao has just lost her father. She is still a child, her emotions vulnerable. You must try to understand, came Grandma's soothing voice. Mom, I fear Yao Yao might have stumbled upon our secret. At these words, my heart sank. Yao Yao has always been a bit scatterbrained. Surely, she hasn't uncovered our secret? You're underestimating her. I'm convinced she's eavesdropping on us right now. My mother's tone grew suddenly sharp. I bit down hard on my lip, filled with anxiety. But she doesn't even know where we are, Grandma retorted, her voice taking on an odd quality. A lightning bolt slashed across the sky. In the room, the lights went out silently. A cold dread washed over me. I realized my error. The voices were not from the next room. They were inside my room. A subtle scraping noise came from under the bed, as if something was slowly making its way out. Terrified, I turned my head. There, emerging from under the bed, were my mother and grandmother. Their necks unnaturally long. They stared at me with vacant eyes. Yao Yao, you were indeed eavesdropping, my mother stated, her smile slight and disconcerting. Run. That single imperative seized my mind. I bolted from the house. Behind me rang the calls of my mother and grandmother. Yao Yao, where are you fleeing to? Confused and frantic, I raced down the streets. Uncle Lee had cautioned that even the police were not to be trusted. Yet, Tonight, the streets seemed alien. All sounds of nature and civilization had ceased. A disturbing silence enveloped everything. Suddenly, the night sky unnaturally brightened with a bizarre hue. Colors swirled together above, grotesquely nauseating. I, struggling against the growing discomfort in my mind, was transfixed by the sky. Abruptly, it looked as though the sky itself was rent by a stark black fissure. From this gaping maw, a vast black eye opened slowly, its baleful stare pinning me down. I tumbled to the ground, frozen with fear. The streetlights around me flickered out one by one. Every light was extinguished. From the shrouded darkness, something immense moved toward me. Its outline was massive, obscured by a shroud of black mist. Terror beyond words gripped me. Suddenly, my brain was seized by excruciating pain. The next moment, darkness engulfed me. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on a bed. Surrounding me were my mother, grandmother, and many townsfolk. They all wore strangely excited expressions as they gazed down at me. "Yao Yao, you're awake," my mother announced. "Where are we?" Pain hammered in my head like a relentless knife. This is the sacred place where each of us born here undergoes the adulthood initiation. After the ceremony, you'll truly understand the profound reasons behind Mom's actions. Her hand gently traced my face, her fingers icy as if chilled by cold water, leaving a sticky residue. "Yao Yao, soon you will join us. I've long awaited this moment," Grandma added, her smile gentle yet unsettling. "What are you all talking about? What ceremony?" Suddenly, everyone bowed their heads, chanting in an unintelligible language that exuded deep malice and inexplicable terror. The terror amplified, rattling me to my core. As they raised their arms, I noticed the same peculiar yellow tattoos on their arms as the one on my mother's body, a mark of their eerie solidarity. The crowd split, unveiling a colossal statue. At its sight, a chill of cold sweat traced my forehead. The figure boasted a serpent's head and a body wreathed in myriad tentacles. It mirrored the statue from Grandma's home, yet amplified to a grotesque scale. A profound nausea engulfed my senses, as if countless knives were meticulously severing each of my nerves. My breathing became labored, and the room spun around me. The towering serpent head gazed down imperiously. It was unequivocally the most chilling spectacle I had ever witnessed. Beneath the imposing figure knelt a man. It was Uncle Lee, bound and broken, his eyes hollow, reflecting a lost soul. I averted my gaze, unable to endure the sight again. "What is this abomination?" I voiced, my horror palpable. My mother's eyes burned with a fierce piety as she beheld the statue. "This is our God." She extended a sharp, elongated knife towards me. "Yao Yao, end the life of the sacrifice and dedicate him to our God. This is your initiation into adulthood." Disbelief gripped me as I beheld my mother. She had surely lost her mind. "I am willing to go, but first you must unveil the truth to me." Curiously, as the decisive moment neared, a sense of calm washed over me. My mother sighed, "You will fully understand once you're initiated into our fold. But since you seek answers now, I will enlighten you. 40 years ago, our town was ravaged by a lethal epidemic. This calamity claimed half our citizens. No doctors dared venture here. We were left to await our fate, encased in the shadow of death. One fateful night, a man dreamt of a titanic being. It possessed a serpent's head and a body burgeoning with tentacles. Upon awakening, a mantra was seared into his consciousness. Each April, by sacrificing 3 lives, the rest will be spared from disease. Skepticism met his claims, but in desperation, he executed 3 powerless souls. He simply strangled them, yet their corpses were found posed in a macabre and cruel display. Following these deaths, the plague was purged from our town. Health was restored to all. This grim tradition has been perpetuated ever since. As more people died, the county's population sharply dwindled. In an effort to boost birth rates, they began searching for suitable individuals from outside to bring back, bear children, and continue the lineage. Each April, these outsiders were chosen as prime candidates for sacrifice. From the outset, my father and Uncle Lee were marked for this fate. Only those born within the county could become acolytes of the deity. My father, having unearthed this grim reality, knew he was marked for death. Yet, to safeguard my future, he refrained from revealing the truth outright. Instead, he meticulously left clues, guiding me to unearth the chilling truth myself. Yao Yao, I have told my tale. Now you must carry out the final rite, my mother said, her smile serene. My child, you have always been astute. From your birth, I knew none were more suited to serve as his most devout disciple. He too had chosen you from the beginning, my grandmother declared, her expression unervingly fervent. So, you murdered Dad and used him as an offering? I challenged, my voice tinged with fury. I struggled to accept that my mother's love for my father had been merely a performance. Equally, it was difficult to fathom the depth of despair and helplessness my father must have endured, confronted with such monstrous truths. Yao Yao, he was nothing more than a sacrifice, whose sole purpose was to bring you into this world, my mother declared, her face distorting into a grotesque mask. I still have a question. If Dad was just a sacrifice, what about that woman and Aunt Lee? They're not outsiders, I demanded coldly. That woman and Aunt Lee were disciples of the deity. The woman gave her life willingly, but Aunt Lee... My mother hesitated, her expression briefly twisted in anger. She defied the deity just to save that doomed sacrifice, and thus was forsaken by the deity. My child, my story has ended, and now the tale passes to you. My mother thrust a knife into my hand, her eyes alight with expectation. All eyes on me burned with a fervent, anticipatory glow. With the knife in hand, I advanced towards Uncle Lee. Those eerie whispers rose again among the crowd. Approaching the statue, my head began to pound more fiercely. My sight grew foggy as a voice seemed to whisper in my mind. Kill him. I forcefully bit my tongue. Then, in a swift motion, I cut Uncle Lee's bonds and, grabbing him, dashed towards the exit. Yao Yao, you cannot do this. My mother's scream pierced the air. The crowd erupted into incensed shouts. They surged towards us rapidly, intent on stopping me. However, I had already reached the front door ahead of them. I thrust open the door, seized Uncle Lee, and we bolted outside. At that moment, Uncle Lee appeared to regain a trace of consciousness. But shortly, I felt his body growing increasingly burdensome. Turning around, I was confronted with a ghastly sight. Uncle Lee's skin was grotesquely bulging. Something sinister seemed to be squirming beneath his flesh. Uncle Lee's breaths were punctuated by agonizing gasps. He knelt on the ground. Abruptly, a chilling sound of skin ripping filled the air. Black eyes, filled with spite, began to sprout on Uncle Lee's skin, fixating their gaze on me.
Yao Yao, I'm tainted.
Flee now. They worship not a deity, but an abominably evil force that contaminates the mind and insidiously assimilates its hosts. Your mother, grandmother, and everyone in the town have been tainted. They've lost all semblance of reason. Uncle Lee's complexion was ghostly pale, a sign of his excruciating agony. As he spoke, those sinister eyes whirled wildly. Hearing the approaching footsteps of my mother and the others, tears streamed down my cheeks. I cast one last look at Uncle Lee, bit down hard on my teeth, and sprinted forward with desperate abandon. I'm not sure how long I had been fleeing, but I finally reached the road. Utterly exhausted, my legs buckled, and I fell to the pavement. I regained consciousness in a hospital. A lovely nurse asked with concern if I was all right. With great difficulty, I shook my head, feeling a torrent of nausea surge. Abruptly, I was racked by violent vomiting. The nurse hastily thumped my back. A sinister black tendril was expelled from my mouth. The nurse screamed in terror. My consciousness slowly dissipated. In that moment, the grim truth dawned on me. I had escaped the small county because it had allowed it. It intended to infect the world through me. I feebly gestured to the nurse. End me. Just wait. I'm calling a doctor now. It can't be. My consciousness ebbed away, and all that remained was an engulfing darkness. Spin-off, Antley. I was born in a mysterious county town. Here, 3 people die every April. As a child, I was terrified. However, my father reassured me there was no need for fear. Death would never claim those born within the town. At 15, my mother was strangled to death. Oddly, there were no marks of strangulation on her neck. A living person was strangled to death in their sleep, leaving no sound behind. From that moment, I sensed something unsettling about my father. Finally, the day of my adulthood ceremony arrived. My father and the townspeople orchestrated a ritual for me. They revealed a vast entity. They proclaimed it was the God I was destined to serve. My mind was inundated with a myriad of bizarre languages. I felt as though I was standing amidst the cosmos, observing the past, present, and future. I embraced the annual sacrificial rituals. Seeking new beginnings, I enrolled in a university far away. There I met Li Han. In his presence, all the troubling thoughts embedded in my mind dissolved. Nevertheless, I brought him back to the county, unable to defy its mandate. I was constantly conflicted, knowing Li Han was intended as a sacrifice, yet unable to quell my profound love for him. Ultimately, I discerned its decree. This April, Li Han would be the next sacrifice. My mind frequently heard voices urging me to kill him. Unable to control my eerie actions, yet just as powerless over my heart, I loved him dearly. Seeing him detained by the police, I knew his end was inevitable. I made a dreadful choice. I resolved to defy it. Perhaps, in this world, there exist forces that are beyond resistance. Yet, surely, nothing is more compelling than a love that has been profoundly pondered, a love willing to cross thousands of miles. Note, the god in this story is Cthulhu, an ancient overlord who interacts with humans via telepathy, often driving many into insanity through these psychic encounters, frequently depicted as the loss of sanity points.